So this is the first time we get to hear about the Oily Taint on Saden, and get ready to hear about his Oily Taint a lot, because we're going to hear about it.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I had this thought. I was listening to the audiobook at that point, and they kept saying the taint a lot. It was the taint was in there deep and hard and stuff.
Oily.
And I was like,
dirty.
Was this a bet that Robert Jordan had with somebody that he could get taint into his story like a bunch of times?
No, we just have dirty minds, James. Welcome, friends, to episode 207 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss the first third of Robert Jordan's 1990 novel, The Eye of the World, Book 1 of The Wheel of Time. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the 2020s by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a podcast began recording a series on a fantasy series called The Wheel of Time and its new Amazon adaptation. The podcast was not beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the Wheel of Time, but it was a beginning. Welcome.
It does feel like we're in a pattern, right?
Yeah.
It kind of feels like we've been here before.
Well, it also feels like this could be the start of something big. Because if this series goes on to cover many books, because there are many books in this series, this could be something we are going to have a lot of episodes on eventually.
Worst case scenario, even if the show doesn't continue on, I'm already just like so gleeful about this. Like it's everything that I've wanted it to be so far, and it's got the familiarity of a lot of other fantasy beginnings. Like, you know, it's got a lot of the things that you're thinking that you want in this genre, and then it's just taking me on a really warm journey so far, even though it's like building up all these stakes, and knowing how long the series is and how big the books are too is just like, I don't know, it's a comfort to me knowing that there's so much story. And I feel like so far with Robert Jordan, I've been taken on a journey that I feel like I trust him already. I'm ready to read more.
I'm glad to hear it, man. That's awesome. We have to talk about our history with this material, I think, to set the stage. But first, if you are new to Ink to Film, welcome. We cover book to film adaptations. We've got over 200 episodes before this covering lots of other things, including Lord of the Rings and other fantasy adaptations and series. But yeah, I am excited to actually get into The Wheel of Time. This is one that we've had circled ever since it was announced. And it's a series that actually does mean a lot to me. And rereading this first book helped me remember why. So for my part, this is a series that I started reading when I was in middle school. My best recollection is probably somewhere in 98 or so. Somewhere in that range, 97, 98. I started reading this because I think there were 6 or 7 books out at the time. And I devoured them. You know, I just loved. This was a time where the bigger the book, the better. I would go to bookstores, and my mom would tell me I could buy one book, and I loved Wheel of Time because I could pick up one book and it would be 1,000 pages, and it would last me. You know, so I liked that. And then I had just started getting into D&D around this time, and this felt very much like D&D, which just played right into my middle school heart. And I was not super well read in fantasy. I'd only really been reading some Dragonlance, which again, very heavily D&D, and a few other books here or there that are escaping my mind. But I know I had read some other fantasy. But then I found this one, and it just was hitting all the right notes. And I had read The Hobbit, but I actually had not read The Lord of the Rings. I was a little bit familiar with the story of The Lord of the Rings because I had seen some of the animated adaptations, but this is well before the movies, so I hadn't the Peter Jackson films. So I didn't have that background going in to recognize a lot of the similarities. So a lot of that stuff completely over my head. So rereading it now,
so it's fresh to you, the first time basically.
It was the first time I had ever encountered a lot of these tropes, a lot of these archetypes, And I mean, there's a reason that they tend to work, right? Especially for young boys like me. And it hit all the right buttons. I love this series, and I read it all through high school, and I think into early college, where I caught up with the series at some point before that, and then it was started to become a point where it was like being delayed, and then Robert Jordan passed away, and the series got passed off, which we'll talk about. I didn't end up finishing it, so I have not finished the series. I was someone who resisted a little bit the change in authors, although I am a fan of Brandon Sanderson now. At the time, I didn't know who he was, and I felt like it was very strange to have someone else writing the series that I loved, and it felt different, and so I kind of fell off of it. But there were other contributing factors, including me falling in love with Song of Ice and Fire, which became my favorite fantasy series when I found that one in college. And I also because it started becoming like a 2-year thing between every book. I got to the point where I felt like I needed to start the series over to remind myself what was going on. And it's such an immense series that just the idea of starting it over was overwhelming to me. So I've been putting it off. So it's always been something I've been meaning to revisit. So I'm glad that we actually got to do it for the podcast here. So that's my long-winded my background with the story. It's been over 20 years since I've read this book, but I'm going back now and reading it. Very cool. What was your experience, Wheel of Time? I knew you've heard of it, but what else?
So I started reading this like a week and a half ago.
Okay.
No, so I mean I've heard glowing reviews of Wheel of Time. You know, I can remember the beginnings of Game of Thrones on TV, like the HBO adaptation, and watching that, and then I went and read George R. R. Martin's books, and I remember people being like, "Oh, if you like that, you're gonna love Wheel of Time. You got to check out Wheel of Time. Like, you know, it's another massive fantasy staple. If you like Tolkien, you like this, you like that, you're gonna like it. So I should check it out." And honestly, it was a daunting behemoth of a project that at some point I really did want to read. And then just as time went on, it built and built, and I wanted to read it more and more. And then we had the podcast, and it's hard to read outside of the podcast sometimes. And I do some, but and actually I've read some Brandon Sanderson outside of the podcast, but it is tough. It's like without the amount of reading that we do some of the time. And so I've never been able to go through this, and I think I've kind of been waiting for it.
Yeah.
But I've heard you talk about it. My girlfriend Caitlin read all of the books during at the start of COVID, maybe even before COVID officially started, before any sort of lockdown or anything like that. She had started the series, and then just basically that was what she's always going to associate those two things. I think Wheel of Time and lockdown and that time period and that year and everything.
Yeah.
And year and a half. I don't know. It was a long time. So knowing that her sensibilities line up with mine, and you've talked about it, and other people in my life have talked to me about it, I've known that I was going to read it. And then actually sitting down to read it was this really fun experience where I was like, damn, I get it. I finally get it. It's like I said, there's a lot of familiarity to it, but it in a good way. I think it's setting itself up to be as different as it wants to be, but currently it's sort of in that safe space, and I know it'll expand out from there. But yeah, that's sort of my history. I've seen the trailer. Since the trailer, I was like, oh man, I hope that this does justice, just for the sheer fact that we'll get to carry on and continue it. And you mentioned how long the story is and how Sanderson finished it. My girlfriend also is a massive Sanderson fan, having read all of his books now, and she tells me a lot about him. And knowing that there is an ending to the story, there's a comfort to it for me as well. Now knowing that I can go through and read it all, and it's all there, and hopefully, I don't know what the consensus is, the Robert Jordan purists and the Sanderson fans, where people land on how the story wrapped up. But from what I understand, Jordan had a really big, he had basically laid the template, and Sanderson executed it as well as he could. So it's comforting to me to know. I really love getting sucked into long-term stories that are always going to be there, that no matter what's going on in your life, you can revisit these characters and continue to go down their journey with them. So yeah. I'm really excited to start this journey with you.
Yeah, and with all of our listeners, I really hope that this series, I'm pulling for it, man. I have my concerns. I have my anxieties, which I'm sure many longtime Wheel of Time fans have as well. But I also share in the excitement and the hype. You know, I'm really excited to see this thing. I know there are going to be lots of changes. We've been doing 200 episodes of a podcast, learning about adaptations, and we've seen it go 100 different ways, you know? And so I'm really interested to see what way they take it, what gets changed. But one thing that I was immediately struck with watching that trailer is just how ingrained my personal conception of a lot of these characters was. Like how I have just been picturing these characters and you know who they are, and they've meant so much to me for so long that it is a bit jarring. And I get that sense that like we encounter a lot of people who have this, right? Like with long time beloved series. And it's happened to me a few times in the past, but this time it really stung out to me because it was this series I read as a child, and I had kind of grown up with them. I am open to, you know, different interpretations of characters, of course, but it going back and rereading this first book reminded me of those early impressions. And it's like, oh yeah, and I can recognize why I formed the impression of like how Lan looked and how Rand was as a young boy here at the start of the series, and like all this stuff. Like I have these deeply held impressions of what they look like and act like. And I'm going to be really curious to see how it strikes you reading it for the first time as an adult, and having the existing trailer out there that has already been cast. And like I'm wondering, were you picturing any of the actors in these roles?
So I watched the trailer. I remember being like, that was cool, you know, like that. It seems fun. I hope this is like what everybody was hoping that it was.
Yeah.
But I drew misconceptions from it because like I had no idea what was going on.
Right.
So like I thought for sure that Moiraine was evil, like was going to be sort of an evil character from the trailer, because she seems and you know there's sort of as we go through the beginning of the story, we get this idea that like
let me pause for a moment and just warn the listener. Okay, so I have read Beyond. James has not. He has only read 1/3 of this book. So when he's talking right now and he's talking going forward, he's basing it off of that much knowledge. If you don't want to know that much, and if you're like new to Wheel of Time, period, be aware we're going to be kind of spoiling our observations from the first third of the novel, which is not a lot. It's probably going to be covered in the first few episodes of the series, I would guess. But yeah, just FYI. So your read of Moiraine is she is not evil. Okay, go ahead.
Rosamund Pike, like the way that she was in the trailer, I was like, she seemed like super intimidating. And, you know, there's this idea that like there's more than meets the eye with some of these characters. And like, you know, there's a certain amount of skepticism that some of the characters have about certain other characters. And so it feels like there could be something there eventually, but it kind of, in the trailer, I like immediately was like, when Moiraine showed up, I was like, oh shit, this has got to be Rosamund Pike's character.
Yep.
And then I was like, well, how is she gonna fuck shit up? Like, how is it? Like, she showed up in the village, and because we've studied stories as much as we have, I'm also picking up on a lot of things, because like nothing is done without intention, and so like there's a lot of things that crop up that I'm like, very important, very important. Like, it's just a throwaway line. Like, anytime history is being given, I'm like, that is factual. That's not just a legend. You know what I mean? That's not just a story somebody's saying. Like, so a lot of that stuff is going into this. And I kind of like that, though, because I'm like, okay, well, that's lore at this point to me, rather than some sort of like story being told or myth.
Yeah.
I like how the characters like seemed like pretty archetypal early on, and then they're quickly breaking some of those relationships down and like splitting them up in ways. And just the journey so far, you know, leaving home, leaving the Shire in quotations, like sort of area into the unknown, and being chased by things that felt familiar.
We will get to the Lord of the Rings comparisons. So yeah, I want to just quickly also mention, I don't know, we might end up cutting it from it, but on pronunciations, we are going to be going with, I guess, whatever occurs to us. I listened to the audiobook this time around, so I've got some impressions from that. Some of them did not line up with the way that I had been pronouncing them for many years. And then the show is almost certainly going to pronounce things differently than either of those two things. So, and there's hot debate among fans how to pronounce certain names, certain cities, certain, you know, so there's just a tons of things, and we're going to try our best, and it might not line up with how you pronounce things, so we apologize for that, but so it goes. Yeah, man, I have a lot to react to there. I mean, Moiraine, she is the catalyst, of course, in many ways. Her arrival is the catalyst, so you're right about that, and I think the trailer does show that. She is kind of mysterious, and a lot of people do think she's they distrust her, right? They distrust the Aes Sedai, and she is one. So I think that's all intentional, right? Like that idea of like what's her true motives, and I think some of that is still going on. Like we don't know what her true motives are.
Oh, definitely, yeah. But at the same time, she's a catalyst in almost like a Gandalf way as well. Like quickly becoming like the powerful person who like you can lean on currently in the beginning of the story to like protect the party in like against unknown odds and stuff like.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so we are that's getting a little bit into plot, which we are going to do. We're going to do deep dive into the plot so far. But before we do that, I just want to get your general thoughts on how do you feel about Robert Jordan's writing as compared to other fantasy series you've read? Do you find him to be more accessible? Do you find him to be like, how do you find his way he handles description, characterization, stuff like that?
It's interesting because like a lot of times when you approach fantasy, non-fantasy readers feel like it's excessive. Like there's too much description. There's not enough going on and more like world building that's being given to you. But I always respond well to that. I always like the world building aspects, and like honestly, some of the time especially early in stories, that can be the thing that keeps me invested more than even like the character interactions and that I find his to be a little more approachable though, I would say, than like your George R. R. Martin or your Tolkien, even because Tolkien is like there's a generational gap kind of thing there where he was like early fantasy in the way that it's extremely like poetic and
he's like, British, and he was writing deliberately with a certain sort of flair that
like a language. He always came from like a language background too, so he's trying to like you said, flair. So I find, not that I in no way is it sparse. Like I think there's tons of description, beautiful settings.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would call Robert Jordan's writing sparse.
But for me, it was more approachable. Like I found it a lot easier to read and just to keep reading and not have to take breaks in comparison to something like George R. R. Martin.
So it is rich. It's got a lot of detail, but you found it engrossing, right? Like it kept you invested, and it wasn't difficult to read.
Exactly.
Yeah, I could totally see that. So I have read a lot of books since I read this novel back in the day. And I've studied writing quite a bit, and I definitely am looking at this from a writer's perspective now in a way that I never did originally. And yeah, I mean, I think the prose holds up. I think it does evolve a little bit over the course of him writing the series, although it's pretty consistent throughout. He does have a ton of fucking details. He will describe someone's clothing and a look and what they're carrying, and them like walking over and setting something down, and that'll take 2 pages. And you're like, I just spent 2 pages describing that. Like but it's like it's transportative, right? It makes you feel like you're in the world.
It's good texture for me. I guess when I'm reading 2 pages like that, I don't think about it in the moment. It's only after the fact that I'm like, oh, there was 2 pages there.
Right. And some people do think about it in the moment, so that is a criticism some people have, and that's going to be stylistic and aesthetic, right? Like, how do you feel about it? I'm someone who's read a lot of epic fantasy. You've read epic fantasy, so that tends to be sort of the mode. And he's one of the people who sort of established the mode, especially in American fantasy. He is a very influential figure in that way. And a lot of times when people think of like the classic American epic fantasy style, a lot of them are thinking about Robert Jordan, who is obviously heavily influenced by those who came before him.
It's interesting to me, too, because I've heard George R. R. Martin speak so much about Tolkien, but not quite as much about Robert Jordan. Is it because they were more contemporaries?
Yes. They were more contemporaries. I mean, Game of Thrones comes out in 96, so 6 years after Eye of the World. George R. R. Martin did, however, when Robert Jordan passed away, he posted about the... But I didn't read the actual post, but it was, from what I understand, he praised the man, and he mentioned that Robert Jordan gave him a glowing review of Game of Thrones when it came out, and that review was one of the things that helped launch George R. R. Martin's fantasy writing career. So he credits him with that. So he is an influential figure in a very direct way in that regard, right? Like I think he blurbed Game of Thrones, which is massive at the time, because he's one of the biggest authors working at the time when he did that.
I mean, just talking about authors and their connections and everything, I do want to talk about, and I'm sure you're going to have more details about this, but I want to talk about the Sanderson Connection too, because I think like the foresight and like the like seeing the talent of someone like Sanderson and to I don't know if he handpicked him to continue the books or anything like that, but like so maybe he helped kickstart George R. R. Martin's career, and then it seems like, you know, being attached to Wheel of Time probably gave Sanderson a lot of confidence and to continue on and you know, write in the ways that he has.
Absolutely. So as for my sort of just general reaction reading this, I was filled with a lot of nostalgia for a certain time in my life. And it's funny how doing that, right? Like you read something that you read at a certain time, and or watch a movie that you saw at a certain age, or listen to a song that maybe was playing at a certain important moment in your life. But it kind of this like time travel, kind of brings you back to that moment. And this obviously is not one moment because it's a big book. So instead it's like a time frame in which I read this. And so I was of two minds literally reading it. I was like 12-year-old Luke reading a fantasy for the first time and just like having my mind blown and just loving it. And then I was adult Luke, who has read a ton of other fantasy, you know, has written some fantasy myself and studied it, and still like liking it, of course, but being able to analyze it in a critical way and in a way that is trying to suss out all of the craft that went into it. So kind of like an under the hood read, which is what I normally do in these kind of books, trying to figure out like why the author is making certain choices, what's the effect, and how are they doing it. So I was able to approach the book from both of those perspectives, which made for a really fun read. I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to read more of it and talk about it with you. I'm going to do my best to be coy and leave the mysteries as mysteries and not sort of tip my hand about future knowledge that I have. And I'm just going to lean on asking you a lot of questions, and you'll just have to theorize and react based off of what you know.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to being wrong a lot, and because you know I think my frame of reference of how some of the events in this are going to play out is always going to be based on like other fantasy I've read and just like, you know, some hints that we've gotten here and there. But I found myself thinking about what it would have been like to read this when I was young as well, though, you know, because that's always an interesting thing to do. And you talked about how it becomes a snapshot of that time in your life. And it has this epic feeling, and there are like things that we're getting that are like outside of the realm of what's going on in this world and the way that the world works, and you know, the hand of fate or something is moving things around, and dreams and visions and like some other kinds of stuff like that will always be important. But prophecy. And like I said before, I love this idea that like for you it was something that like you were waiting on the books to come out, and like a book would come out and you would read it and it would become that moment in your life. Like that was how Harry Potter and like tons of other books have been for me when I was growing up. And it's interesting too, because we have to like be careful not to have like rose tinted glasses about some of this stuff, and like be able to look at it critically. So, you know, coming into it as an adult, there's a certain like cynicism that I think you have that you don't as a kid because you don't have the experiences and stuff. But I've been able to like sort of put myself in both frames of mind and be like just enjoying it and giving it a chance. You know, I think we're only a third of the way through this book so far, and it's, you know, it's to be expected that it's sort of Jordan is probably like looking at other writers before him for inspiration and things like that to sort of find his own voice. I think that's safe to say.
So speaking of reading it how I read it as a child and reading it from a child's perspective, you may wonder, is this series YA? What is this? That's a good question, and it's one that I think has been asked a lot. And it has gone through phases. So it was originally sort of marketed as adult fantasy, and I think it still is considered adult fantasy. However, it begins in a very YA feeling place, and the publisher is well aware of that. And one of the things that they did was re-release the first book in a 2-volume set, specifically aimed at the young adult audience. And when they did that, they added a new prologue, which we both read. I read for the first time, because I didn't even know about it. because you told me it was in your copy of the book, and that was the first I heard about it. And that was added to the book by Robert Jordan to appeal more to the YA audience than the current prologue, which deals with Luz Theron. So I'm excited to talk about these two prologues in comparison to each other. But before we get to that, I just wanted to mention it's kind of both, and in a way that is a little odd in fantasy. But it also like totally works for it, I guess. And like it made sense that it appealed to me at my age because it was kind of YA, but with like hints of being for more adult. And I think I liked stuff like that. I always wanted to be reading above my reading level, reading stuff that was more adult. And I liked that it had the hints of stuff. But this is not in any way like George R.R. Martin level of adult. Not very different tone of a series.
Yeah. It's interesting too because like series can grow with you.
Yeah.
Become more mature as time goes on. And I'm sure that this series probably does. I don't think Robert Jordan necessarily was like saying like his target demographic was young kids, but it seemed to speak to them. And then like to have like that experience of growing up with these characters and then becoming more mature and more mature themes coming into the books. I mean, like that's a invaluable thing. I think that's a cool way to grow up with this series, and it means more to people rather than maybe just remaining YA and sort of outgrowing it at some point in terms of like what you're interested in.
I just want to make it clear I'm not trying to denigrate YA at all. And say that it's somehow lesser or greater than if it's YA versus adult. I just think it's interesting that it kind of straddles those two categories of fiction in a way and sort of appeals to readers of both.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess it sounded like I was saying that like you outgrow YA at some point. I still read YA stuff. I still enjoy that sort of those sort of stories as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about who Robert Jordan was first before we get into the actual plot. So his real name is James Oliver Rigney Jr., and he was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1948. He would go on to fight in Vietnam. He was a helicopter gunner, and he would then train troops after the war was over. While in Vietnam, he was awarded after Vietnam, but for his actions in Vietnam, he was awarded the Flying Cross, a Bronze Star, and 2 Vietnamese crosses. I briefly read over these awards, these medals, and they were basically all given for heroic valor, acts of singular heroism, and that kind of stuff. So it seems like he was well decorated for his time in Vietnam. He attended military college in South Carolina when he returned, where he majored in physics and became a nuclear engineer in the Navy.
Wow.
But around that time, he began his writing career. He published under multiple pseudonyms, including a historical series and a Western, under 2 different pseudonyms. And then he would write the Conan the Barbarian stories. He is one of several writers who have written original ones, and his are considered some of the best that are not by Robert E. Howard by fans of the series. So Robert E. Howard is the originator of Conan. So Jordan was a history buff, and he enjoyed hunting, fishing, sailing, poker, chess, pool, and pipe collecting. He described himself as a high church Episcopalian and received communion more than once a week. He lived with his wife, Harriet McDougall, who works as a book editor currently with Tor Books. She was also Jordan's editor in a house that was built in 1797. Sometimes he is called one of America's greatest fantasy authors. His series is lauded for its complex magic systems and characters. Wheel of Time originally was supposed to be 4 or 5 books by Robert Jordan's own words. However, with every time he would sit down to write it, he would end up expanding. And by the completion of the series, it was 4,410,000 words, comprising 14 books plus 1 prequel novel. And if you were to listen to that in audiobooks, it is 19 days, 5 hours, and 25 minutes of audio.
Wow. So we got our work cut out for us.
It's a big one. His series draws on numerous elements of both European and Asian mythology, most notably the cyclical nature of time found in Buddhism and Hinduism, the metaphysical concepts of balance and duality, and a respect for nature found in Taoism. Additionally, his creation story has similarities to the Abrahamic religion's creator, light, and Shaitan, the Dark One. Shaitan is also an Arabic word that is in Islamic context is used as the name for the devil or Satan. It was also partly inspired by Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. The Wheel of Time is notable for its length, detailed imaginary world and magic system, and large cast of characters. The 8th through 14th books reached number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. As of 2021, the series has sold over 90 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling epic fantasy series since The Lord of the Rings. So it's up there. This is a massive one. It's interesting that it didn't hit number 1 until book 8. So that shows you that although it was popular, it took a little while before it hit that sort of mega fame. And it grew and grew and grew over time. And then it's only going to grow more. It's about to sell a lot more copies. I can tell you that with this adaptation coming out.
Especially if it's good,
Especially if it's good.
Continues to be, if it continues to be a thing in the zeitgeist for a while, it'll stick around.
Yeah. So those Conan the Barbarian novels, Robert Jordan wrote for Tor Books, including a novelization of the movie Conan the Destroyer. These proved successful, and in 1984 he proposed the idea for an epic fantasy series of 3 books to Tom Doherty, the head of Tor Books. Doherty approved the idea, however, knowing that Jordan had a tendency to go long, he put Jordan on the contract for 6 books just in case. Jordan began writing the novel that became The Eye of the World then. So this is kind of par for the course, where there's a lot of different stories out there about the length of the original series and what it was intended to be. The thing I quoted earlier was supposedly from Robert Jordan's own words, so this is maybe from Tom Doherty's perspective. So the novel proved extremely difficult to write for Robert Jordan because characters and storylines changed considerably during the writing process. This actually, I did not know this, and I found it to be really interesting. The series was originally centered around an older man who discovered relatively late in life that he was the chosen one who had to save the world. However, Jordan deliberately decided to move closer to the tone and style of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring and made the characters younger and less experienced. Once the decision had been made, writing proceeded much more easily, and Jordan completed the second volume, The Great Hunt, at roughly the same time the first book was published. So that change ended up lighting a fire, and he was already known for writing quickly. It is said that he wrote his first novel in 13 days. And he continued to write these massive tomes at a breakneck pace early on, publishing one a year for many years, before he slowed down to doing one every 2 years.
That's so unbelievable. I can't even believe. I mean, we talk about somebody like Stephen King who writes a lot.
Yeah.
But not all Stephen King novels are this long, and all of Robert Jordan's.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that Jordan writes faster than King, but they are. I think they're of that same caliber of just insane speed. So Tom Doherty enjoyed The Eye of the World so much that he declared that it would be the biggest fantasy series since Tolkien, and he took the step of sending free review copies to bookstores in the United States to generate interest. The combined hardcover and trade paperback run of the novel sold out of its initial 40,000-strong print run. Sales then doubled with the publication of the second novel just 8 months later, generating even more interest for the first book. So the series is popular, as we've discussed before. It's finding success, but it's a first book. It's not his first book he's ever published, but it's his first book in the series, so it's kind of unknown. It's growing. It's growing over time. It's interesting to look back at the criticisms and reactions to this early novel, and it does seem like people both loved and hated the similarities to Tolkien. Many people thought it was great. They loved all the references to Tolkien. They thought it was this homage. They felt like it was, kind of in dialogue with Tolkien, was heavily referencing Tolkien, clearly influenced by him. Others saw it as copying, as, stealing, as pretending as if these are original ideas, and yet many of them are lifted right out of Fellowship of the Ring. And I'm curious to know for you, because you are such a big Lord of the Rings fan, when you were reading and you were like, well, that is clearly very similar to Lord of the Rings. So, you're encountering the Myrddraal for the first time, and it's described just like a ring wraith, basically. There's so many things you can point to. Just the two rivers in general feels very much like Hobbiton, right? How did you feel about that? Did you feel like it was a positive thing, or did you feel a little bit of resistance? Like, I don't know how I feel about this guy doing this.
I you know what? I can see people being sort of upset about it when the first book came out. But I'm reading this story knowing that there's like 14 books or whatever. And so that changes my perspective on it, knowing that at some point it can't be the same thing anymore. It's got to be a lot different. Yeah. And I think knowing that like the beginning can be somewhat similar. There's been other stories that I've read, other fantasy stories that do a similar kind of thing. Maybe they saw Jordan do it and said like, I want to be in dialogue with Tolkien as well. Yeah. And, did a different spin on it. I think there's room for those kinds of stories. And so like, it didn't bother me. And I actually kind of liked like this nudge, like, hey, like this is clearly in conversation.
Well, and I should say this was not unique to him. Lots of other fantasy authors around this time and leading up to this were sort of copying Lord of the Rings, doing their own versions and spins on Lord of the Rings. Terry Brooks comes to mind. Some authors like that. And for my money, his is actually less similar than other authors I've read who are more clearly the same.
The thing that works for me well is his fellowship per se.
Yeah.
Is different enough to where and the characters are strong enough and clear enough to where I feel like it's in conversation rather than being like a direct, because I think character is extremely important. And if the characters were if he had like halflings or anything, if he had, you know what I mean, it would become like almost too much to bear.
Yeah.
But I think like he plays it just right here. And, I don't know, it felt familiar and fun to me so far. And no, it didn't bother me.
Okay. I mean, it's good to know. So it clearly didn't bother me when I originally read it because I didn't know. I barely had any concept of what Lord of the Rings was. I had read The Hobbit, but I had not read the other books. So it wasn't something that occurred to me. I can see it now. I think he is more referencing and paying homage. And he's borrowing, but that's okay. You're allowed to do that. And he does absolutely, that I'll confirm. It goes on to be very different in many ways. So yeah, it's just kind of a starting place, and it works okay for him. Is that something that other authors should try and emulate? I don't know. It's risky, right? It's very easy to have publishers say no when they recognize something as being very similar to certain other things, especially something like Lord of the Rings.
You just have to read the room in terms of like what people are looking for currently. Because I don't think if you tried to do this right now, it would probably be that.
Oh no, they do not want Lord of the Rings clones right now in fantasy. I can tell you that. So and partly because Robert Jordan was one of the last ones to do it really well, and I think it's like now it's kind of been done. The other thing that I have to remember is that the Peter Jackson films were not out when this came out. So because of that, Lord of the Rings always was popular. People loved it. But it wasn't like it is today, where everybody knows what Lord of the Rings is, because everybody has seen those movies, it feels like. You know what I mean? Like, it's so common that I don't know if he would have chosen to do it had he written these books after the films, because then it would be like, instead of an inside reference to readers of fantasy who love it, it's something that everyone who picks it up is going to pick up on.
There is probably a large percentage of non-fantasy like readers that knew Tolkien for sure. But he was doing it as an homage for fantasy readers. He was like, people who love fantasy are going to read this and get the homage. And like general audiences might come to it and think of it as fresh. And he made it clear enough to where I think you can say like anyone who's even like slightly read the beginning of Lord of the Rings knows that this is it's in conversation, no question. And so like, I think that's a good point to make, that like the movies weren't out and it wasn't everyone in the world. It was fantasy readers or, large percentage, more than just fantasy readers read Lord of the Rings, but you know what I mean? Like it was primarily like in conversation with it for the hardcore fantasy readers.
Exactly. Okay, so I have 3 paragraphs of plot to summarize this first third of this novel, and I'm about to get into that. Before I do, I just want to make a note. For the longest time, I thought, and in fact, until doing research for this episode, I thought that Robert Jordan was Mormon. I guess I got my wires crossed somewhere because Brandon Sanderson is, and I thought that he was as well, and that was like one of the reasons he chose him. That's not the case. As I said earlier, he is this Episcopalian Christian. He's a Christian, and he clearly was pretty religious to be receiving communion multiple times a week and all that stuff. So I wasn't wrong in the sense that he was pretty deeply religious, but just a little bit wrong about what exactly he followed. So for those of you who care about such things, I just wanted to get that clear.
It'll be interesting for me to, I didn't really pick up on a ton of religious allegory yet, but like, the good and evil, devil, the god sort of thing is like kind of there. So we'll see like how that plays out if it becomes more religious as time goes on.
Right. The Eye of the World's prologue, Dragonmount, is set during the Age of Legends, roughly 3 millennia prior to the events of the series. The prologue introduces Taren Telamon, the dragon, victorious commander of the forces of light in the war against Shaitan, the Dark One. His victory came at a cost, however, as a result of the tainting of Saidin, the male half of the true source, which was the Dark One's final act before his imprisonment. Taren has gone insane and murdered his family. He is confronted by Ishmael, one of the Dark One's chief lieutenants, who restores his sanity. Faced with the magnitude of his crimes, Taren commits suicide, creating Dragonmount. The early chapters of the book are set in and around the rustic village of Emond's Field in the Two Rivers region of Andor, where most of the primary characters reside. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to talk about the introduction to the book. We're going to talk about this prologue, which is mostly what this little paragraph talked about. But then we'll also talk about the new prologue that was added. What order do you want to tackle these in?
I think I would prefer to tackle it with Ravens first, because that was my first thing I read.
Okay.
That was the first thing in the book for me.
So I read that last. I actually read the entire, all the way up to where we were going to stop, and then I went back and read the Ravens. So the last thing I read, but yeah, just to quickly summarize that, it's Egwene when she's 9 years old. And she is walking around. She's seeing ravens who are watching the men of Emond's Field, looking at her some. And then she overhears a conversation between Rand, Perrin, and Matt, where they're talking about some of this stuff. And I think Tam is going to tell the story of Taren. And she hears some of that. And then it kind of sets up this next prologue, because it's like, well, I wonder what the real story was of Taren. Is like, I think, the last line of this new prologue, and then it goes immediately into this one that I just described. What was it like going from Egwene, the 9-year-old, into that? Like, what did you? I guess before even that, what did you think of this opening prologue? Like, how did it strike you?
Yeah, so I have many thoughts on this. So I already read the prologue when you were like, "Oh, that's added. That's a new one," and it's made. And you kind of told me it's like sort of more for a younger audience, and that's all you gave me about it. And I had already read it, and I kind of felt like in my mind that was the beginning of, like, that's how a lot of people experience the beginning of Eye of the World, and I think it simplifies a lot of things, like really early on, to like get you to let you know who's who, what the relationships are, and you can immediately, the Egwene Rand relationship is being set up heavily.
Yeah, that people say they're going to marry one day.
They're going to marry, and like it's very heavy-handed in a sense, and maybe not even in a bad way, but it is clear like what's being set up in a way that, in my mind, if I read just Dragonmount first, it would have been much different, much more like off the deep end. You're just like dropped into this really chaotic moment, and then we switch over to something that's completely unrelated, which is the Two Rivers.
Welcome to me as a 12-year-old reading this book.
Right, but I do like that in a story. I like the deep end moment. I think jumping straight into story.
So for you as a modern reader, as an adult reader, you maybe would have done without the prologue chapter?
I think so. I think that I bet you tons of people get a lot out of it, getting to see them young, having already read the books. Yeah. I think people would probably love that, to see them young, because
it was kind of cool to see them at that age. That was kind of fun. I'll grant it that.
And the other thing is that, like, I think it heavily gave some lore stuff that I felt like
it provides context for what you're about to read that you otherwise do not have. When you read that first prologue, you don't know what the hell is going on. Like, I had no idea what was going on.
There's a couple things, like, within the stories that are being told to the children where, I was talking to my girlfriend about it a little bit, Caitlin, and she was like, I wish that you hadn't read that, having some of the details that I gave her. And she was like, I don't even know if you should verbatim say that, because it's, like, almost borderline a spoiler for, like, books and books and books and books down the line.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, well, and I'm not going to mention it here. I think that, like, if people wanted to, they could go read Ravens and they could pick it out, I'm sure. But yeah, so I guess my reaction to it is just like, I kind of wish I hadn't read it, but it was fun, and it, like, it definitely handheld me enough to where like I feel confident in knowing exactly who the characters are, exactly sort of the paths we're heading down for now in the early goings of this novel.
Okay. So then we get Dragonmount, the original and OG prologue to the Wheel of Time, that does throw you in the deep end. We meet Taren as he's sort of wandering the halls of his palace. There's chaos everywhere. There's bodies everywhere. He's talking to his dead wife. He's talking to his dead wife, who's like dead on the ground near him, and he doesn't even know it. Like, what was your take on this opening prologue?
I mean, I have to make the comparison to other fantasy that I read before. It felt very like Mad King a little bit to me, where it's like you're getting this sort of like story from back before, where something's gone wrong with a leader, and like they were, you know, you don't really get any specifics, but you can see that some of the stuff.
So you're referencing Song of Ice and Fire.
Song of Ice and Fire with them,
which came after. You know, so if anything, you know what I mean? If anything, maybe Martin was influenced by Jordan, because it is interesting to note Taren gets called Kinslayer here for killing his family. And there's a quite famous Kinslayer in the Game of Thrones series. And I don't know if there's any, you know, I don't know that Martin borrowed that or anything. I'm not going to claim that, but it's just interesting.
Great minds think alike. We'll just leave it at that, you know. Anyway, so so to Dragonmount. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was so cool and weird. Like you said, like someone sort of snapped him out of it also.
Yeah, this guy who shows up to taunt him, like grants him a moment of clarity in an act that seems to be intended to just torment him. And then he uses that moment of clarity to commit suicide with this.
Clearly extremely important. Like this is going to be like as important as like some of the early things that we get in Song of Ice and Fire. And I'll stop making the references at this point. But like,
or you could say Lord of the Rings, right? Like talking about the movies, at least we got this flashback to the original War of the Rings. I don't know what that war was called, but where the ring gets cut off the hand, right, of Sauron. And this similarly is like a big flashback to, you know, ages and ages ago. But like I don't even know if that's clear at the time when you're reading it, right? Because
no, it's not. I think it gives like heavy lore that I think like as a fantasy reader, you know, going into this more innocent story that we get in the first chapter in the Two Rivers. You know that like that is like lore that will become important as this story plays out. So,
oh man, when I read that originally, I was like, how the hell are these two things related? Like you get this prologue, and then you all of a sudden we got these like young kids going about their daily life on a farm in a village, and I'm like, where do these things line up? You know, and it takes a while to really find out, and you get little references to it, and then you know, when you're not as familiar with fantasy. And the way that authors tend to do these things, like, you know, young Luke, I was just like, I don't understand, like, what that, like, I was almost off-put by the start. Like, it was interesting, but there's also just tons of...
You almost thought it would never be readdressed. Like, it was just this crazy one-off thing?
Well, no, it was more like it almost lost me because it's disorienting. That opening chapter for a young reader is a lot to ask. You have some complex political situations being described. You have a war being described. There's a lot thrown at you. There's tons of new terms, neologisms. He has invented so many words that are not real, and he's throwing them at you, and you're supposed to be like assigning meaning to them by context clues. That's hard to do.
That is a skill too, because you at some points as a reader, you have to almost take a defeat there and just say like, I don't get it yet. Yeah. But hopefully you have to trust the author to like, you know, circle back on it to sort of like give you the context later. And it's funny because I can imagine myself as a kid just being like, what the fuck is this? You know, like, what does this mean? What is this one thing, you know?
Yeah, and so I remember as a kid, I almost stopped reading the series after that first chapter because I was like, I don't know if I can do this. But I did get into the next chapters. So I was like, oh, okay, I can do this. This I can do. I like Rand. He reminds me of myself. You know, he felt like me, but maybe a little older than me. So someone to aspire to be. And, you know, I grew up in we both grew up in a fairly small-ish town in Florida, not like a village or anything, but like, it's not a major city, right? Like, you're away from a lot of the big, exciting things that are going on. And so I identified with that, and feeling like kind of separate from the world in that way. And yeah, I don't know. I just, I I found the prologue to be fascinating as a kid, a little off-putting, but then, it became this thing where I was constantly wondering, like, what it all meant. As an adult reading it, I loved it, and I was like, this is the kind of thing that would make me want to read this series now, because I would understand the purpose of something like this. I would see it as an ambitious start to a series, and it felt that way to me reading it now. It was heavy. There was, like, he's killed his own family. Like, that's heavier than most stuff you're going to read for like a younger audience. So, like, I think it's a great introduction to the series if you're an older reader. If you're a younger reader, maybe have someone read The Ravens first. So it's just going to depend on the reader what maybe is going to work best for you.
Yeah, I mean, putting it in that context, I think that's definitely was the intention of Ravens, right, originally.
Yeah, I guess it's been included in future volumes ever since that original split volume was released, and it's in the one you have. So this is the first time we get to hear about the Oily Taint on Saden, and get ready to hear about his Oily Taint a lot, because we're going to hear about it.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I had this thought. I was listening to the audiobook at that point, and they kept saying the taint a lot. It was the taint was in there deep and hard and stuff.
Oily.
And I was like,
dirty. Was
this a bet that Robert Jordan had with somebody that he could get taint into his story like a bunch of times?
No, we just have dirty minds, James. I just thought it was funny, yeah. And it's something that does get referenced quite a bit. But I do want to know just your thoughts on your initial impressions on magic in the Wheel of Time. What you saw in this prologue, and then what you've seen later on. What are your impressions on, like, what magic is like in this world? Do you like it? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so for one, it's still extremely mysterious to me. I still don't really understand the system overall. The idea, and like I've heard you speak about this a little bit, and my girlfriend has also talked about it. It's interesting to how gendered the magic becomes, and like that's definitely a topic that we're gonna have to talk about.
It's split into the female half of magic and the male half of magic, and the male half has been tainted by the Dark One, and the female half is untainted.
And it's evil and aggressive and and it can't be trusted, and so they have to seek it out and destroy it.
So it's a gender binary that I do not agree with, but in the sake of this series is the canon. So that's what we'll go with going forward. But that is absolutely a criticism I've seen people level at this series. I think it's totally valid. He chose to break down his magic system this way, and it provides a lot of interesting conflict. But it does lean into the binary of gender, which is a myth. So
it's very like it's not very forward thinking. It's kind of like very status quo for the time period, and like I'm sure he didn't think anything of it, honestly, because he probably just didn't even deal with it.
It's probably just something he had internalized, and something he didn't even think about.
So, but overall, I mean, like, I like that it's powerful. I like that there's levels to it, because like we've heard of bigger feats of magic and how in years past that.
Well, you saw Luce Theron, what he was able to do. Like, his magic alone had like killed all these people, and like there was earthquakes happening, and he literally erupts into a mountain when he dies. So that's pretty powerful.
pretty nuts, yeah. I like that in my fantasy stories too. Like, I love seeing the characters struggle against impossible odds, obviously. So like knowing that there are forces out there that they couldn't possibly contend with currently. It's fun. It makes for like a really big world. And so far I do like that there's like different, there's a character that I really love so far, and it's the Gleeman.
Yeah. Tom Maryland.
Tom.
Yeah.
And he's like borderline magic and mysterious enough to where you're like, what's going on with this guy? But he's like conjuring knives and shit, and like fucking like like that kind of magic exists.
His is more like sleight of hand stuff, but
right, which I love. But it's also kind of like it's like maybe there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean that's true across the board for a lot of characters, right? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
I'm glad you like Tom Maryland. He was also an early favorite for me, so that makes sense.
The of course importance of certain weapons that like people don't even realize that they're important, and that sort of thing is very fantasy-esque and but appreciated.
So let's talk about that. So I basically am setting this up all the way up till Beltane. So up till Beltane is the introduction. We meet Rand. He's with his father Tam Althor, and they're traveling into Emmons Field. and they see this figure, this writer, or Rand sees this writer who then disappears when he like looks back, and then he finds out later that Matt and Perrin also have seen writers, I believe. And what was your impression of meeting these three guys? We hear talk about Egwene, who, it's notable, was not a POV character in the original version of the book, but in the new version, now it's like when he mentions Egwene, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's that character from the prologue. So again, that changes that dynamic a little bit.
I mean, like, I don't know if she is for the entire novel. You know what I mean? So if you're basically saying that she's not for the whole novel.
I don't think it's a huge spoiler to say that this entire novel is from Rand's point of view. It's in the way that these early chapters are, other than Lews Therin. In the way that he's like semi-omniscient sometimes, but I feel like it's closely tied to Rand's perspective. That changes in future novels, but in this first novel, it's all from Rand's point of view, I think. Is my memory of it, at least.
So meeting Rand and his father, it's like the ultimate like father-son sort of like wish fulfillment, like sort of like what you would want out of a father. I think his dad.
So you like Tam?
So right away, so likable, so capable. So
he feels sturdy, right? Like he just feels like this rock that you can rely on.
Oh, and then as the details sort of come out, he's like there's more to him that no one knows about, and he's got this mysterious past. And he's clearly this
there's more to a character that no one knows about. Is a good theme going forward. That will come up again and again and again.
Yeah, but this is a play on the Tolkien thing, right? Like instead of the riders showing up and like all just attacking immediately, I liked the foreshadowing, or not even foreshadowing at that point. It's really just like the tension building of there's a threat and it's looming and it's going to show up again. And at first it's described in a way where I'm like, is it evil or is it just mysterious? You know, and then
that reflects Rand's uncertainty, and
everybody else who sees it, they're like, this is something that we should investigate. Like sort of the boys themselves are like, maybe we should investigate this, and it come to find out it's not something that they should be even trying to contend with. It would have been the worst possible decision if they did.
I actually really liked how individually they were dismissed, but when all three of them came together and told people, Tam tells Rand later, he's like, well, once we knew all three of you had seen it and you're all three like solid boys, like we know something's going on. And so I also thought that showed like there were definitely times where he resists that sort of trope of the adults all are clueless and the kids know what's going on. That's not really the case here, right? Yeah, and especially someone like Tam, who seems worldly and to have all these secrets and to know more than he's letting on. I think it's safe to say early on. Okay, so that sets up everything. We meet Nynaeve for the first time. We meet the Peddler. We meet Padden Fane. We meet Tom Marilyn. So lots of characters are introduced here. But these early chapters are very pastoral. They're very soothing and sort of calm. There's this threat.
Yeah, especially because Rand and Tam are farmers too. Like they're shepherds.
We get a lot of descriptions of the simple life of Emmonsfield, how isolated they are from the rest of the world, how they all are sort of like shepherds and farmers and blacksmiths, and there's this ancient like building that is the inn. And it seems like there's a lot of history in this area, but it's also like it's been static. Like life has been the same here for hundreds of years, it feels like. And they are sort of content in their sheltered status away from the rest of the world. And as a modern reader, I know this is going to be shattered, right? Like this is not going to last. As a kid, I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, this isn't, you know what I mean? Like I didn't know that. I hadn't experienced Lord of the Rings. And so that leads us to our next point where I'm going to read the next paragraph, but it's kicked off by a literal kick. And that's when a Trolloc kicks in the door of Rand's home. Him and Tam have gone home before the next day. They're going to have this, the Beltane, this holiday. And he does a good job of setting it up and talking about all the things that's going to go on the next day and setting up the event to where you're excited for it. And then they're getting ready to kind of lay down for the night. Tam locks the door for the first time. He's never done that before. And then he goes and gets the chest out and he gets his sword out. And Rand's like, oh, I've never seen that before. Where did he get that? And, there's a fun little, bit where he talks about how, like, it's worthless to a farmer. Like, I should have sold it a long time ago, but, like, now he's using it. So I think that's an ongoing theme that we can get into more about like power and like what it means to have power and what you should do with it. But yeah, we're getting a little bit of that here. And then the door is literally kicked down by this Trolloc and everything goes kind of crazy. And I'll read this next paragraph here of a plot summary. So on the eve of Beltane, an annual festival celebrating the arrival of spring, an unexpected attack by bestial Trollocs and fearsome Mildral seems to target Rand al'Thor and his two friends, Matrim Cauthon and Perrin Aybara, specifically. Hoping to spare their loved ones and the village from further attacks, the three young men resolve to flee the village by night, accompanied by Moraine Damodred and Aes Sedai and her warder, Alan Mandragoran. He's a mandragon. As they attempt to leave, they're discovered by the innkeeper's daughter, Egwene Alvir, and a wandering Gleeman, Tom Marilyn, who joined them. Okay, so that is the events of Beltane. I think let's talk about that, and let's talk about each of these characters, too. I think I want to get your initial impressions of them. Let's start with Rand, like our main POV character. What's your take on Rand?
I felt very similar to you. He's the prototypical, protagonist of a fantasy story at this time, like cis white, like,
Yep.
Young boy who
I thought it was funny that he had like an observation at some point where he was like, and I suppose girls might find him attractive, and I was like, all right, no homo, right? It just felt like he was like very clearly saying, I don't find him attractive, but I suppose girls might. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of very
make that note. Yeah.
Very hetero.
I like the character, I think there's a lot of potential for greatness,
Yeah.
and that sort of chosen one thing is already like very clear to me.
He's very immature, right? Like he's never seen the world. Did you find him to be a bit foolish, or what was your take on him there, or?
I mean, a little bit, but like as is to be expected, because we're gonna experience this world through his eyes as we like are introduced to it, but. More like you can tell that he's like been raised correctly to where he's got like a good moral compass,
head on his shoulders kind of deal.
He's gonna be the kind of person who will do what's right, and like even if something crazy happened and he was and like some sort of responsibility was thrust upon him, he would probably try to turn it down first, and then.
All right, we're gonna get some theorizing about the fates of these characters and what's gonna go on with them. I think at the end of this episode, because I'm really curious to know what you think. Okay, so let's move on from Rand. He's our protagonist. He's kind of an author stand-in. He's kind of a
He's a wish fulfillment character. He's the ultimate, fantasy wish fulfillment character.
I think Rand is an absolutely fascinating character, but I think in the first book is not necessarily the case. He's all right. I think he becomes a lot more interesting. Okay, so what about Matt Cauthon? What about Matrim Cauthon? How do you feel about him?
Love it. Love Matt. Okay, so this is the kind of, and like it says a lot about me, but this is the kind of character that I loved as a kid and still do, and kind of like the trickster. I love these kinds of characters. I kind of identified with them a lot.
Yeah, he's known for being a prankster. People don't really. He's kind of the boy who cried wolf. Like people don't like to listen to him too much.
Yeah, I identify with that a little bit, and maybe not so much now because I've sort of
sure.
He tends to be the kind of character that's like plays around too much and doesn't take things super seriously all the time, and I like that I love that kind of character, and the Archer.
He is kind of foolish, right? Like I think it's safe to say. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. For sure.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, kind of. I mean, they all are good with a bow. I think that's specifically pointed out. I think Rand is maybe even the best when they all draw later. And then you got Perrin Aybara, who I feel like has done less in this early third of the book than I remembered. But I don't know. What's your take on him? Do you feel like you have a good sense of who he is?
No, I really don't. But I can kind of see the archetype of like the kind of like strong, like more quiet, reserved person, the kind of person that like, again, like could be thrust, if leadership was thrust upon them, they'd be good at it, but isn't seeking it out sort of thing. Blacksmith, protege. So like, it's that kind of like, capable.
Yeah. There was a description I really loved for Perrin where he's this big guy. And when we first meet him, he's in a crowd. And Rand says that he could have pushed his way through, but instead he like very carefully picks his way through the crowd and is like apologizing to people who he brushes against.
Yeah.
And it just totally makes it's like he's a big guy who's very aware of his size but doesn't want to like assert it and use it to like push people around. And I think that's very telling for him. Perrin is a character that I adore. He's maybe my favorite of these three. They all are great in their own way, and their arcs are very unique and interesting throughout the series. But I always loved Perrin. I loved this like strong silent type, and who you haven't gotten much of a taste of it, but has a very deep, rich inner life, which you will get. Unfortunately, I think in later books is really where you get it. Okay, so then let's talk about Moraine and Lan together, I guess. This pair, this Aes Sedai and Warder. What do you think of the Aes Sedai and Warder pairing? Like this, what is your read on that? Like, what does that even mean?
I mean, like it's such a. I love the duo. Obviously, I like the way that they're taking someone who's more like combat oriented and somebody who's more like magical, and like having like a warden, like somebody to like, almost like a ranger type person who's like.
You getting some Aragorn vibes from Lan? Maybe,
maybe. But maybe. I guess so. But yeah, this idea of a character who is good in terrain, different kinds of terrains, and like good at tracking and understanding and hearing. Like I think we'll get to the attack, but he's like sort of the beacon who's like, oh shit, attack! Yeah, we got to go fight. So I like that character a lot. And then Moraine,
that's all part of this, right? When they arrive in the village and the attack's been going on, they hear that Moraine and him like ran out into the street basically to warn that the Trollocs were coming, and she like summoned ball lightning or something to like kill a bunch of them.
Yeah, she's like insanely powerful and like super intimidating. I love like how mysterious, and of course one of the coolest things you can do as a fantasy character is just say like, oh yes, this is the prophecy. This is how everything is supposed to be, and she keeps doing that when people say something.
The wheel weaves as the wheel wills.
Exactly.
There we go.
And like having this external knowledge of like knowing better than anyone else could possibly know, like the events of what are going to go on, and like I said, sort of a Gandalf type character as well early on, where it's like that everything's going to be all right as long as Moiraine is around, or at least it feels sort of that way. And even if you thought that there would be a situation she couldn't handle, then that's why Lan is there too. Like the duo between the two of them, like when she's like used up all her magic and healed everybody and done all kinds of crazy stuff, she needs to relax and like heal up. Then you're like, okay, well he's got everything covered as well. So you have like a double Gandalf protection situation early on.
Or Gandalf and Aragorn working together as a unit. So. Funny mentioning, I will probably say Lan a lot because that is the pronunciation I had internalized over 20 years. But I think Lan is how it's said in the audiobook, and maybe that's what it really is. Yeah. I'll be curious.
I don't even know how I just
said Lan, which is how I think it is in the audiobook, and I assume that's probably correct. I may say Lan just out of accident because that's how I've internalized the name. But yeah, I mean, they're great, right? They're super interesting. They're super mysterious. And Lan is like, he's this badass who every time he speaks, I don't know about you, but I'm like hanging on every word. And that continues to be the case for him going forward. He's always a character that I am just endlessly fascinated with, want to hear everything he's got to say. I'm
also fascinated about their like why he's so like obligated to be like a sort of joined at the hip with her. Like I don't understand the relationship very fully yet. I get that like
there's a bond between Warder and Aes Sedai that you've heard referenced, but you don't really understand it. That totally makes sense. I know a lot. I'm not going to share it with you. But yeah, it is really interesting, and you're asking the right questions, right? Like how does it work? Why is he bonded to Moraine? What is their relationship really like? Yeah, I think those are all great questions. And then I guess let's talk about Egwene. She is our prologue character who is now back and ends up joining the Fellowship as they're readying to leave. What's your take on her as a character? Do you feel like you get a good sense of her? I think Ravens provides more characterization for Egwene than the original novel does. That is one thing I will definitely praise about it, is that it does a good job setting up her as a character. in a way that we get like tastes of in the original version without that prologue. But I feel like I know the character better after reading that prologue in the sense of this opening.
Yeah. I mean, definitely agreed, because we're, her POV, how she's interacting with people. She's like delivering, what is she, like hay or pots of water or something like that?
She's buckets of water, yeah. And she wants to be the best one at carrying buckets.
Yeah, which I like a lot. Like that's a good characterization thing, like right away, where you can see that character.
Yeah. Well, and she mentioned she wants to leave the world, like leave Two Rivers one day.
Which I love. Yeah. And I'm very like, this is probably my favorite character so far.
Really?
Yeah, because I love the like sense of adventure. I love that like the relationship is being set up between Rand and Egwene, but there's tension, but there like heavy tension. And then there's also this like thing that Rand is having to grapple with, is that she has her own agency. She seems like she wants to go pursue other things out there in the world that might leave him behind.
He feels threatened.
And he doesn't know what his future is going to bring, because it's all up in the air. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that, because like that's a character that like I would like to see Egwene go off and do whatever the fuck she wants.
Well, and we see that like Rand's ultimate, it feels like his heart is in Two Rivers, right? Like his life that he wants is in Two Rivers. He's like, and we get that Egwene, that's not necessarily the case. Like she dreams of leaving. She dreams of going elsewhere. Maybe that's just the next village over early on, right? But when she gets, the indication that she can go to Tarvalon, or Tarvalon, I think is how they say it in the audiobook. Again, it's another thing that I've been saying in a different way for 20 years. Like she's leaping at it. She's excited, and Rand doesn't know how to feel about that. In fact, he gets kind of upset, and they have this argument about it. It seems like they're really sort of butting heads over this attitude towards the rest of the world. I think that's really notable.
To make a theory / what I want to happen, I want to see obviously this party break up and everybody go do their own things. I really want to see Egwene like go out on her own for a while and go pursue this thing, and have Rand, whatever happens with Rand, I have other theories about what I think is going to happen. I can almost guarantee it's going to happen, actually, that he, at least early on, he's going to go have another course of action. I hope they split, and then they have time apart for a long time, and then maybe then they can come back together and have a relationship later, because like right now I think it's like I'd like to see them go become individuals and have their own stories and everything, and then maybe come back together later. Okay. If there is going to be a romance there, which has
I was going to ask you, do you feel like that is what's destined here, with the full understanding that you don't know?
Yes, I think that it's very clear that there's no way that they don't end up together, but who's to say? It sounds like the story gets a lot more complicated as time goes on. So I don't know if both of them make it to the end, or to their eventual, relationship, or whatever that could end up being eventually.
Okay. I know things, but I won't share. All right. And then Tom Maryland, you already mentioned one of your favorites. I'd like to get your take on Nynaeve, the town wisdom, which is at the end of what we read. We read up to chapter 15, the end of chapter 15, by the way, which at the end of chapter 15, she's showing up at the inn to meet up with everybody. We'll get to that. But yeah, I just wanted to know your early impressions of her.
Big fan. She's like a big sister to the group or whatever. She's like not taking bullshit from anybody and telling people what they need to do.
Yeah, she doesn't take shit from anybody.
And she is like a wisdom already at a very young age, which I found to be really interesting, because it's something that's not just like a farmer or, a blacksmith or something. So that was cool to like get to learn about her and like how she came up really early on. And people like some people don't respect her as much as they should, even though she's a wisdom, because she's young. And like, the what can come of that. And then the interesting connection from the wisdoms to the Aes Sedai. The connection between those two things, and like getting more about the Aes Sedai, learning more about like we've heard vague things. One of the only things that I know about the story is like the colors with the magic, and like I've heard people talk about that, and like I know that like different colors.
You're talking about the Ajahs? We've heard reference the red Ajah. Was referenced at one point, but other than that, I don't think we've heard much about them.
No, the Red Ajah are the ones who hunt the men, who show
false dragons,
magical prowess.
They say, yeah.
Yes.
I want you to also react to the Dark One's denizens, the army of the Dark One. We got Trollocs, we got Myrddraal, and we got Drakkar that are about to show up. What did you think of these creatures and beings?
I had to make the connection to like orcs in my mind for a little while with the Trollocs to like
they're very orc like,
sort of bridge it.
Yeah,
and it's literally called like basically troll orcs.
Yeah,
so it's like almost like orcs and trolls, and like there's something in there with that.
Yeah. Now they are described as being in Robert
They're
Jordan's
like more
defense.
bestial.
They're bestial.
They're
They're all different too. Like some of them are like wolf-like, some of them are like horns, like a ram. And sometimes they have hooves and sometimes they don't. And yeah, they're like these like Island of Dr. Moreau creatures or something a little bit.
It's cool. And I like that actually too. Yeah, I thought it was really different, but just like the clear fodder to be like the evil like underlings.
I thought it was notable that like when I was thinking back to this opening where the Trolloc kicks the door down, I thought it was just one. I thought one Trolloc attacked, but there was a bunch of them. And they even like they give him the slip, and they're described as being kind of dumb. And then Rand ends up killing one on accident. And yeah, you can tell they're like, yeah, they're the fodder. They're the stormtrooper of the series. I think that's safe to say.
Yeah, which is fine. You know, we need that. And I'm sure that if one catches you in a corner and you don't have a weapon, it's not a great
exactly. I mean, they're supposed to be powerful, and you're not a badass like protagonist character. Then yeah, you're probably in trouble.
Right.
But then you got the Myrddraal, who are our ring wraiths. What did you think of them? They have this cloak that doesn't move.
Yeah, I was having trouble distinguishing like the Myrddraal with the like. I thought that they were all sort of just like shadow being. They call them like the
fade.
half man, the false man, the fade.
Like, yeah, all those are all names for the same being.
So I was thinking, like, are they all sort of just like different incarnations of the same thing, or are they like actually tiered? Is there a tier system to like how deadly these ones are? I'm assuming that's more of the case, but yeah, the Myrddraal, very ringwraith, they're on like basically horses chasing them and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
and then you got the Drakkar show up from the air, and I couldn't help but think of the what are those called, fell beasts or something in Lord of the Rings? Yeah, the things that the ringwraiths ride later. I kept thinking of those, and the way they screech. It's very reminiscent, right? Like the screech to alert. But they're different, right? And they're sort of, they have these bat wings. I guess we haven't seen one up close or anything yet, but there's kind of a spooky moment where one goes up against the moon and Rand sees it. We're about to get to that. In fact, let me read the next paragraph because we're going to get to that. So chased by Trollocs, Myrddraal, and Drakkar, the 7 companions make their way to the nearby city of Baerlon, where they encounter Min Farshaw, a young woman gifted with prophetic visions, as well as Dane Bornhold, an officer of the Children of the Light. They also find Padden Fane, a peddler who was presumed dead after the Trolloc attack on Emond's Field. Also in Baerlon, Rand and his 2 friends begin experiencing dreams in which they are taunted by an arrogant man who calls himself Baelzaman. Shortly before they depart, Nynaeve Almira, the village wisdom of Emond's Field, arrives to retrieve the 4 villagers. And we're going to stop there because that's the end of the chapter we finished on. But yeah, let's react to that. So what did you think of this wild ride, and how much did it remind you of Fellowship of the Ring and the ferry crossing and all this stuff?
So much. I mean, it couldn't have been more similar. It's just so similar. But I liked it. It was different enough. I like the idea of like these ferrymen like almost like robbing them, but then stopping short of doing that because like when people aren't looking, people get desperate and that sort of thing. And then they get like they basically like tugboat them from the outskirts of the stream like all the way up it, which I think is interesting as well. And
we're seeing Moraine's use of the power throughout in ways that I thought were really clever. The fog, but then I actually really like the way she is able to reinvigorate the horses, who are described as having like a lather and needing to rest, and she's able to make them be able to push on and on. And then she even does that to the people. And then, but Lon says the only person she can't do that to is herself. So she's getting more and more tired as she's.
Well, I also think it's important to note too that like she can do that, but like he mentions that like the horses would gladly like run until they just died, like keeled over and died without even realizing it, because she's almost like removing like a barrier that should be there sometimes, like a will to stop because you need to before you die.
Yeah. So it's kind of scary and that kind of spooky in that way, right? Like, you could, it's like she's taking the safety off a little bit. Yeah.
we have to talk when we're talking about the ferry, we have to talk about the fact that like they pay them well, they get dragged along, and then at the end she like, and it's kind of like subtle enough to where like if you could say like, oh, a random whirlpool, but it was very clearly Moiraine was like fuck your ferry, you're not gonna help the enemy come after us, and then they pay them well for their ferry or whatever. They're just gonna have to like get a new one.
Yeah, she whirlpools that thing right down to Davy Jones' locker. There we go.
Yeah.
But we find that we hear word that Nynaeve found a way anyway, even after the ferry was sunk. But that becomes a thing they keep thinking about as our three boys here all start to become a little bit mistrustful of her. And there's even some talk of how they could maybe slip away and go somewhere else rather than go to Tarvalin. With her.
And there's an interesting thing that's sort of known in the society that like they're dark friends or something like that. So that's an important thing too, that like it's almost like in my mind so far propaganda to make you like distrust them a little bit, but then there's probably
you're saying that Aes Sedai are dark friends,
right? All the Aes Sedai, it's like almost, and then it's a blanket thing, and then Egwene and Rand have an argument about the fact that like he's saying like you don't want to be an Aes Sedai, like you like I don't know why you're doing this, and she's like because I fucking want to, because I have powers and abilities, and he's like well they're dark friends, and she's like you don't even know what you're talking about, you're just painting everything with a broad brush,
right?
And she basically is like well she saved your father from death, which we barely touched on. She literally brought him back from like the edge of death, which we're talking about like ancient power. Moiraine mentions when she's doing that like Aes Sedai at some points have been able to like basically bring you back from the smallest minuscule amount of life remaining in your body, bring you back to full health. Mm-hmm. And she's like that the days of that happening is gone. So like seems like power is waning currently where we're at, and like magic has been waning a little bit at this point.
That's a good pickup. Yeah, that's definitely the case. One thing you said there I think is notable for like some thematic stuff going on, which we'll talk about more in future episodes, but the idea of the stories about Aes Sedai, that they're all dark friends, being kind of propaganda and maybe not true. I think,
but there has to be a touch of that is true. Like there's a reason why that is true.
But the you had said earlier, like when I'm hearing these stories, I'm like, oh, that's fact. That's something I'm going to hold on to. But then like this isn't. So I think that's important to note, right? Like it's the nature of stories and the nature of opinion being melded into fact, and how that can then seem like fact to people, which honestly is very timely with what's going on in our country today. And I'm really interested to see how much they carry on with this theme, because it's a little more subtle, but I wonder how much we'll get that in the show. But I think that is very important for the series, and the way that stories change over time, and then how stories can be accepted as fact, yet sometimes stories are not actually factual. They may have nuggets of fact, but they may also be wrapped up in opinion of whoever's telling the story.
Yeah, some of the like you think of the stories that like Tom was telling at points, like there's like someone who was in like the breast of a bird that like flew to the moon, like a fire. Yeah. I'm like, that's like some sort of like ancient feat of magic, that's something that was important in some way, and like those kinds of stories I feel like are like the ones where I'm like,
could also be metaphor, right?
Could be,
yeah.
But probably not.
Okay.
But could be. But like I think like the ancient stories are more easily, because of the way that they keep talking about how like the pattern and like things come and go with the wheel, and then like it seems like they're like it's definitely setting up for the fact that like everything comes back around, and like there's like a wave to it, like magic rises and falls, and like events come and go, and I mean even this being the dragon reborn stuff, it seems like the dragon, like the fact that it's even reborn is like a cyclical thing as well. So everything seems like there's a lot of cyclical nature to it.
And also, the dragon reborn feels very much like a Jesus kind of thing, right? Like Jesus being reborn, like as and then there's the Antichrist and all that stuff. I don't know. I'm not a Christian anymore. I was raised that way, and I've forgotten a lot of stuff. But I think that's like canonical for Christianity, that there's going to be a second coming or something, right?
He's like, yeah, he like dies and rises again, basically.
Well, yeah,
Like,
originally before, yeah, but like he's gonna come back again, right? Isn't that supposed to happen?
Oh yeah. I think
It's supposed to be a second coming or something.
Someday, yeah.
Someday.
Yes, that's the idea.
So that's kind of similar to the idea of the dragon being reborn someday, right?
One day it'll come.
And that's
again,
kind of the way people treat it. Like it's like
Mm-hmm.
almost a religious thing. But then when people come back and they claim, "Hey, I'm me. That's me. I'm the dragon reborn," everyone's like, "No, you're not. That you're a false dragon."
Well, you talked about the devil too, so let's talk about this the visions,
The dreams,
the interactions that Rand is having specifically,
Mm-hmm.
and then up to the last one, which is like he fucking says his name or whatever, and I thought
Balzaban. That's what he says. He says some people call me Balzaban.
Sauron is like communicating directly with Frodo right now, like, you know what I mean? Like it's there's no question in my mind that he's like keyed in on Rand and said, like, you know, you're this like fucking second coming of a dragon potentially.
I think he says, like, are you the one, or are you going to be sort of used by the White Tower, right? And he says you're going to be a tool of the White Tower. And it's also notable that Perrin and Matt had the same dream, it seems like. So what does that tell you about this conversation he's having with him, if they all had a same dream?
I like the idea that they were seeing the Myrddraal, they were all seeing that there's it's basically said that, like, and like this is pulling up from a lot of other stuff, but at this point we know that Moiraine has said, like, this area, the Two Rivers used to be great warriors and this and that, and they flourished and they fought alongside the Aes Sedai and all these other like feats that they did. And she's like, it's so sad to see you guys in your current state, because it's like you're no longer those great people anymore.
Yeah.
And we're getting that, and they used to fight in the what is it, the Trolloc War and all that other stuff. So now they're just sort of like more meek, and they're not doing as much. And these three boys, like, they're looking for someone of this age for a specific reason. That's what the Myrddraal are here, and they're looking at all the boys in town. And, you know, so I think that this is like a prophecy. This is my theory. There's like a prophecy that's been foretold that there will be a boy who's, like, you know, born again from this area potentially. And so I wonder if it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where, like, this devil character or whatever is going to choose one of these three, and then that person will become the Dragon Reborn, or if one of them is actually the Dragon Reborn, because they each seem special enough to potentially be it. But as a reader, as an adult fantasy reader, I can see that Rand is the main character, and he's probably going to be the one that it is. So I guess I'm just curious to see if it is sort of like an option, or if it was Rand all along. And then of course we get Tam. One of the most important things is, like, Tam, when he's been hurt by the Trolloc, he's sort of hallucinating and giving all kinds of crazy details.
Had a poisoned blade that was forged in Mordor itself. I mean, not Mordor, not Mount Doom. Shaitar.
So he's dragging him along, and he's saying all these things, and we find out that Rand isn't actually Tam isn't actually Rand's father.
Yeah,
or at least that's the implication that we get.
Not only is he potentially a chosen one, he's also an orphan, a secret orphan,
a secret orphan. And you know, the secret orphan is a fun trope, and I'll be excited to see how it goes going forward, and the way that prophecy and like memory and important moments are sort of like changed. I like that we get this like snowy battle where Tam finds Rand basically, and like I like that's gonna stick out in my mind.
He's talking to his dead wife, and they have this unknown. He has this unknown parentage, right? Well, and it's said that he has these like blue eyes that no one else has, and he's taller than everyone else in Two Rivers.
So it's going to be a thing that I connect eventually somewhere down the line.
So
like
that's a mystery, right? There's a lot of mysteries already stacking up. I think it's safe to say. All right, I want to ask you about Min. I want to know what your take is on this character. She gets introduced in the final chapter we read, so you haven't got much of her. She shows up and she says that she has a special ability.
It's one of those, being the last chapter too, I haven't had a ton of time to process, but I think that you are led to believe as the reader that, like, whatever at least me having read a lot of fantasy, like, whatever she's saying is probably, again, like, factual in some way.
She's dropping lots of prophecies, right? She's basically she can see things on people that, like, predict the future, is basically what she says. And then she starts dropping stuff like crazy about Lon, about Moiraine, about all three of our main guys. Like, she's just dropping. And you don't know what to make of them, right? There's tons of images. There's like a dagger. There's, there's 3 women by a funeral pyre, and there's all this stuff.
I literally,
What?
all of those details like flew by me.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't have pulled any of the specific details.
Yeah,
really.
there's so many. There's like there's a crown of like leaves or something. There's a sword, like there's stuff with lawn. There's like there's all these things, right? And you're like, what does that even mean? And then she starts like making these interesting references about her and Rand. What did you make anything of that? Or she was just being weird, and she was like laughing at him as he leaves and stuff, and she's being kind of creepy, honestly.
Yeah, it's tough to like kind of parse through and figure out what's going on there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very mysterious, and
fair enough. I think we can leave it at that. She's mysterious. Okay, so yeah, I think now let's just talk about any other. I want to know your other theories before we wrap up here. About what's going to happen going forward. Where is our group going to go? Are they going to make it to Tar Valon? Are they gonna have to fight these Trollocs and Myrddraal? And beyond that, where do you think we're heading with this first book?
So like I've said, kind of course, I think we're going to get to the Rivendell type area, which would be like this like magical area with Aes Sedai, and we're going to get all of them just like reveling in all this magic around them and what a different world it is from where they're from. And then I think I really do think that this party is going to break up. I think they're going to have different things going on. I think that they'll have different goals. At least that's what I hope. I would like to see it kind of blow open and have everybody have their own interesting path that they take. And it's tough to know whether, as a first book, you have to think that there's some sort of arc and closing movement or something that happens at the end to like sort of make a satisfying ending for the first book, but also tease you for the next. And I don't think I really have all the information to figure out how this first novel, because I can see the overarching sort of enemies and things building up, and wars and tension between peoples and like things that are like powder kegs ready to blow. But at the same time, like I don't know which specific thing is going to be picked for this novel here, and what like the final conflict would be of this novel. Okay,
so let me ask you this though. You mentioned before that you are predicting and you're thinking that maybe Rand is destined to be the Dragon Reborn. Is that accurate to say?
So they're going to run into the false dragon that they keep talking about. That they'll definitely be running into him. Yeah.
Okay, and what does that mean? If Rand is that?
The darkness wants to capture him and use him, as Moiraine has said she wouldn't let happen because she would kill him before she let that happen.
And what would that mean his role would be in the story?
To fight against the darkness, to be the beacon of hope and everything, to be the person who would...
How's he going to fight him?
Good question. I don't know that I have enough yet, but...
Okay.
Because I don't know what the threat's going to be at the end of this novel. So, but whatever it is, I think Rand is going to, almost unwillingly pick up the sword, or metaphorically or literally take up the sword and like fight for what's right, and save at least a small, maybe not the world, but like a small conflict or something from some sort of darkness overtaking them in this first one.
Okay, I think that's a good place to leave this. I think we should describe our sort of unusual plan for how we're going to cover this project. It's a little different than what we normally do. So this is how it's going to go down for us. We are going to be doing 5 episodes on The Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World, and the first season of the Amazon series. You are listening to episode number 1. Good job. You did it. Episode number 2 won't be coming out until December 2nd, because next week we are going to be taking the week off for Thanksgiving, and we are going to be putting out a From the Vault episode, which is one of our formerly a Patreon exclusive episode that we're going to release on the main feed. So you will be getting that, but not Wheel of Time until the following week, where we do the part 2 of the novel. After that, we will be doing our first episode on the show itself, and that'll be on December 9th. That episode will be coming out, in which we will cover the first 4 episodes, episodes 1 through 4 of season 1 of the Amazon series. Then the following week, on the 16th, we will release our final book episode, where we finish out The Eye of the World. And then the following week after that, we're going to be covering a different project. So we're going to be doing a fantasy project, but it's going to be like a Christmas theme. And that's because The way the timing worked out, unfortunately, the series finale is coming out a little bit too late for us to be able to tackle it. And what that means is we're going to push our final Wheel of Time episode to the following year in early January. You'll be getting the final episode covering the rest of the series. So you'll have to wait a little bit on that one, and we hope you do. So that's going to be our fairly unusual schedule here going forward. But that's the only way that we could find to do it in this kind of, crammed holiday season coming up. But yeah, we hope you join us for all of these episodes on Wheel of Time. It should be super fun. I'm going to be really interested to see how your predictions change in this next chunk here, or stay the same, or evolve. I'm very excited for that. And I hope you enjoyed listening to this. If you did, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, give a like to the video and make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment. A lot of different providers have ways that you can comment on episodes directly, and we'd love to see some of those, because usually we get notified and we can come and respond to them. That'd be a lot of fun.
Make sure to connect with us on social media as well. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And recently we opened our Discord to everyone who wants to be a part of it. So we have the information on our Council of Inklings on Facebook. It's a Facebook group. And then also, if you wanted to join in, you could just message us on any social media platforms. Let us know you want in, and all you have to do is just have listened to one episode, and we have more intimate conversations in there.
Yeah, we'll send you a link.
It's a lot of fun. We've had conversations about everything from other nerdy fandoms that we like, our pets, just
video games, all kinds of stuff. We'd love to have you on there. Absolutely. If you would like to support this podcast, if you like the things that we do and you want to give us a little bit of financial support, we would much appreciate that. And the way to do that is to go to patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can sign up to multiple different tiers, find the one that suits you best. We'd love to have you on there. If you do that, you're going to get bonus episodes every month that are adaptation adjacent or experimental in some fashion. And we'll be releasing another one of those in November. We are going to be watching the original David Lynch 80s version of Dune, which was one of our last major projects. I want to circle back to that. Which, by the way, I didn't even mention this in the episode, but I want to mention it here. I was catching some Dune references. I'll be interested to circle back. Maybe next week I'll talk about that more, since we kind of ran out of time.
I was really happy to go from a sci-fi fantasy to a more high fantasy, It was just a lot of fun. I love going from major project to another major massive project.
Yeah, we don't normally do that, but we're doing it here. I mean, we had Carrie in between, but yeah, we're doing that here for the most part. Anyway, we'd love to have you over on Patreon. That's what that was about. Okay, man, that's going to be it this week. I'm so excited to read another chunk of this book. I hope you are enjoying it as much as I am revisiting it. Sounds like you are.
I really am. All these little details that you've been giving me, I'm now going to rewire my mind and maybe see things from different perspectives and pay attention to certain characters a little more.
I'm trying not to give you too many hints, but it's hard when we're having these conversations.
We have to talk about it.
Exactly. All right, and until next time,
keep adapting.